So anyway, I'm excited to have Venkat here. I read his blog. He's actually influenced a lot of my thinking lately. I'm finishing a book. He sort of hacked my mind unintentionally, perhaps. His first book, Tempo, is an excellent book. Working on his second book. He has his PhD in aerospace engineering, is that correct? From the University of Michigan. Consultant, blogger, thinker, all-around interesting person. I'll let him do the rest. So thanks guys for coming, and hand it over to Venkat.
Hashtag being LA.
Yeah.
This is on?
That's it.
All right, I'm going to try and save my voice because I don't want to rank up here. Sort of. Okay, so as Patrick said, this is not going to be the typical sort of thing you guys like to talk about. One connection is that this is sort of the minimum viable product for my next book, so I'm looking to test out some ideas and we'll see how we go. So think of it as a sort of planetarium visit for technology. Most of it is going to be completely useless, but hopefully it'll give you a little bit of a better appreciation for what's going on.
You may want to hold my closer.
Not better, much better.
Eat the mic.
Okay. It's been a while since I didn't have one of those lapel mics. Okay. So a little bit about how this book project came to be. My first book was, my background is in control theory. That's my PhD area. And this is sort of a popular attempt to be slightly Malcolm Gladwell-ish version of decision making in humans. And this was mainly focused on individual decision making, a single person. And one of the things that happened after I released that book was that a lot of people started applying the ideas to organizations, and they kept coming back at me with, all right, we don't want to talk about individual narratives and how we tell our own stories. We want to talk about grand narratives and organizations and so forth. So I said, all right, let's do grand narratives, and why not pick one of the biggest ones out there? There's no point in being shy if you're going to be doing grand narratives. So Game of Pickaxes is sort of an attempt to do a grand narrative of technology. Okay? And that's the exciting stuff. Okay. So the title is Game of Pickaxes, right? So you guys paid to come here. I think I've already helped you get your money's worth by not calling this pickaxe or knowledge or something. So, but anyway, so what is this game we're talking about? So the game metaphor in business and technology is very common, right? We talk about things being game changers. We talk about things being a level playing field. So that's Tom Friedman's wondrous flat metaphor. You talk about seeing multiple moves ahead of the competition. And then, of course, you talk about fixing the game, right? So this book, how many of you have read this by Roger Martin, Fixing the Game? Okay, so this is one of the better books that's come out on how to fix Wall Street after the last subprime crisis. And he has probably one of the best uses of sports metaphors I've seen in business writing. So he compares Wall Street's relationships with Fortune 500 CEOs to the NFL and MLB, and shows that Wall Street versus CEO is more like MLB and its governance, and that actually is at the source of a lot of its problems. Whereas the way to really run Wall Street well as a fair game that creates a lot of economic growth and value is to treat it more like the NFL, where the governance is wise. And the main sort of design philosophy for him is, in football, you have to keep offense and defense kind of balanced to make for interesting games. Otherwise, offense rolls all over defense and you get boring games, or defense sort of stonewalls offense completely. So he kind of applied that metaphor. And that's the typical way you see game metaphors being applied in business. People think in terms of these sort of fair playing field games where you say that, all right, if things are fair, things are good. And if things are not fair, they need to be fixed. And Martin's view on Wall Street is, well, let's fix this game by removing all the unfairness and so forth. And I thought about it a long time, and I realized that really asymmetric games that are sort of stacked in the favor of one player, they're not necessarily bad. In fact, as I'll try and argue a little later, they're the reason all of civilization exists. So my broad thesis that I'm trying to explore in this new book project is asymmetric games with sort of evolving complexity are at the root of how technological and civilizational evolution happens. Okay? So what do I mean by games of asymmetry? So you're all in the startup world, so everybody is familiar with the 220 formula. Raise your hand if you're not familiar with the 220 formula. All right, this is how venture capitalists and hedge funds work. So 2 is the management fee and 20% is the upside commission. So when they get their money from the limited partners, they get 2% flat for managing the money and investing it wisely. And if the startup succeeds and has a big exit, they get 20% of the upside. If it fails, they get nothing, right? So it's kind of that phrase at the bottom, heads I win, tails you lose structure. They can't lose. They're going to make money either way. It's just a question of how much money. Moral hazard, how many have not heard of that phrase? Okay. Moral hazard is, for example, when you rent a car and you drive more unsafely because you're not going to pay if you get into a crash, right? So that's moral hazard. Principal agent is like going to a doctor who gets to go diagnose you with specialized information and then decide what to charge you for it. Auto mechanics are the same way. So it's an asymmetric situation again. Pickaxe markets, what's the logic behind the phrase, when there's a gold rush on, you should be selling pickaxes to the miners? Well, actually mining for gold is a positive to negative distribution, right? You might lose all your money and may find no gold, or you might make money. But everybody needs pickaxes, whether or not you find gold. So if you're in the business of selling pickaxes, you're again all upside. Bringing a knife to a gunfight. Limited liability. Think about it. Limited liability is actually a thoroughly stacked asymmetric game, where if your company builds wealth, grows, and sort of does general good for the economy, you win, everybody wins. But if you screw up and your company sort of creates, the only thing it creates is like maybe BP, a huge toxic dump, social costs, everybody else pays, you kind of get away free. And that's limited liability. Patents and lots of this heads I win, tails you lose is actually the title of one of my blog posts, and it's about how corporate culture is basically designed to work this way. So these are all the sorts of games of asymmetry that are sort of pervasive in the economy. And when you see them all over the place, when the pattern is far more common than symmetric games where it's like, all right, you start off in the same place and whoever is smarter and has better skills wins, that pattern is so uncommon and this pattern is so common, you have to ask, all right, should we really be sort of getting all moralistic and saying this is evil and the other way is good? Or what's actually the dynamics of this stuff? Okay, so let's talk about how technological evolution happens and think about it in relation to natural selection, right? So natural selection, classic Darwinian theory, you have things like bell curves, right? Like the height distribution in this room, some people are tall, some people are short. In events where height is an important factor, like basketball games, that's going to be a selection factor. So that's what Darwin meant by natural selection. So traits within a species, they're kind of normally distributed, and they create a certain evolutionary path. A species might get taller if the environment rewards being tall, things like that, right? And these are, I call them Olympics variables because these are typically what we compete on in Olympic-style games, or even board games, or any sort of even thing that we typically think of as a game situation where there's a few outliers one way, a few outliers the other way, most of the people are in the middle. There's some people who are like 5 feet tall, some people who are 7 feet tall, and a lot of people who are maybe 5'10", 5'11", but there's nobody who's 12 feet tall, right? But if you look at technology and the important variables that drive technological evolution, you get very different sorts of asymmetry. So wealth, for example. So we were just talking right now about, I think it was you who mentioned that, oh, I would like to be Tony Hsieh in Las Vegas. That guy is like pouring $350 million into downtown Las Vegas and sort of terraforming the urban culture of the entire city. And well, Patrick practices judo and is maybe like 6 inches taller than me or 7 inches, I don't know. So he's like 50% more capable and he can beat me up, right? That's one differential, that's this sort of evolution. But Tony Hsieh and I, if that was the equivalent of height, you can imagine, that guy would be like a 10-story skyscraper and he would stomp all over me if wealth was actually a biological variable. So what happens when you think about evolution that's driven by natural variation that has that kind of what are known as fat-tailed asymmetries? How many people have heard the word fat-tailed? Okay, good. I'm kind of doing these spot checks because I have a tendency to go off and use terms that I assume everybody has heard before. But fat tail means you have a lot of extreme outliers, and lots of distributions in complex systems are fat tail. But the interesting thing is, when you have things like this driving an evolutionary system, you get, first, a faster pace of evolution in some sense, and also a lot more volatility. You have empires falling and declining, empires rising again, so you have a huge amount of sort of up and down motion. So my broad thesis for how you understand technological evolution is, if you just think of humans as humans, well, you should get something that looks like natural evolution and proceeds at about the same pace, but humans plus tools starts to give you huge asymmetries, right? Oh. Okay, so if you look at where else do you find this kind of fat tail distribution and that kind of more complicated evolutionary path, you have to look at the ecosystem level, not at the individual species level. So for example, if you look at animal sizes, mammal sizes, the smallest mammal, I forget what it's called, it fits on the palm of your hand. It's like an inch long, I forget what it's called.
A wall.
Okay, a wall. And the biggest one would be the blue whale, which is like 100 feet tall, right? So there's like several orders of magnitude difference between species. So if you look at important variables that determine evolution and technology, they look more like an entire ecosystem than a single species. So you have to get these things right because they make a difference in how the evolutionary path plays out. So if you're making up the metaphor that corporations are like competing in a Darwinian economy, you have to ask, all right, exactly what are the characteristics of the evolution? Okay, so let's ask a question. Why don't we just kill these super outliers? Like, before Rockefeller became big enough to buy up the planet, or Bill Gates gets big enough to like completely eradicate AIDS, hopefully. Why don't the rest of us say, all right, this guy is soon going to be big enough to stamp all over us. Why don't we just, kill him while we still have a chance? And on the flip side, well, maybe they're too powerful and they sort of get on this runaway path. Why don't they kill the rest of us, right? So, in a way, you can get the answer in a little bit in evolution. That's why blue whales don't necessarily kill small mammals, right? So, the question becomes, so this is sort of planetarium level questions. How do you model this evolutionary path? And there's a lot of people who've thought a lot about this question, so I'm in good company. And they say that your second book is sort of what makes or breaks you as a writer. Well, I'm competing with Karl Marx and Richard Dawkins. So, I mean, what have I got to lose, right? So I might as well swing for the fences here. So there's a whole bunch. So Joel Mokyr, for example, he's one of the best-known historians of technology evolution. And he has, I think, the most compelling model of why Europe leapt ahead of China between 1300 and, say, 1800. And his model has to do with, say, path dependence and how innovations built on each other and so forth. So his unit of analysis is still human at one level and nation state or empire at the other level. And his model has to do with path dependence. McLuhan came up with this idea of extended humans, where he said that all technologies are extensions of human media. So it could be, for example, humans can run, say, 40 miles per hour. I don't know how fast big people sprint, but well, with the airplane viewed as an extension of our feet, we can fly at 500 miles an hour, right? So that's what he means by all media and technology are extensions of humanity. So that's his model. Neil Stephenson, I think, has a very interesting model that's underrated because he thinks about everything in a sci-fi way. But he thinks that we should really think of extended humans as different species altogether. And H.G. Wells wrote this book about a century ago about how technology would differentiate humanity into two species called the Eloi and the Morlocks. And Neil Stephenson, in one of his essays in the beginning of there was the command line, he talks about how we are heading into a future where most of humanity has no freaking clue how the world works. They're just this useless, decadent civilization that lives on top. And then there's all these Morlocks who live underground and can, run the Amazon cloud and do all these, design multi-core processors. I mean, these are the Morlocks and they run the whole thing. And in H.G. Wells' original story, the Morlocks used to actually feed on the Eloi. And something like that is actually sort of happening now. Karl Marx, well, he has some of the smartest things to say about this stuff, but he unfortunately got moralistic about it and ended up adopting basically a good versus evil model, which is also similar. You find the same evolutionary model in religions. Dawkins is interesting. So people have heard the term selfish gene. So Dawkins came up with that, and he said biological evolution does not happen at the level of individuals or the species, but at the level of genes. And he titled his thesis The Selfish Gene, and then he tried to apply his ideas to technology and society, and he came up with this idea called a meme. So his idea was that these micro units called memes are what determine evolution. So you've got, there's a whole lot of people who propose various sorts of organizations like corporations or nation states or various other aggregates of humans as the right evolutionary unit. There's people who sort of think all this through and decide that everything is either going to collapse, that's Jared Diamond, or all the singularity people who believe that we're evolving towards a planetary AI, right? So you've got all these interesting models, and I think they all have something or the other right about them. So I hate to sound like somebody who just lumps a whole bunch of models together and calls them all of the above.
So it does sound like that.
Yes. So, like I said, this is where I'm starting, but I'll get to what sort of adds some elegance to the model later. But yes, all these actually matter. So, my unit, so just remember, I haven't even, this is my kickoff for my book. So, recursively homeostatic bags of different sorts of two extended humans defined by internal real technique data. So, I tend to think in these words, and then people like Patrick come and yell at me and say, why don't you talk like humans? But I happen to be a species that's evolved in a particular direction.
You're the lone warlock.
Okay, so what I mean by this is, I'll get to these phrases here, but I'll elaborate on them through the top. But I'll just leave that up here. Leave the words real technique and data in your head. I'll explain what they mean in a minute. Some of you who follow a lot of political science may recognize that. It's from like Cold War politics or 19th century European politics. Okay, so we'll get to that. But let's talk about, all right, since this evolution happens at the ecosystem level, you really have to talk about types of ecosystems. And just like biological evolution, there are some things that are common to all species, like DNA. And evolutionary theorists speculate that at one time there were a lot of different replicator molecules, and DNA kind of won the competition. It's like the dollar standard for the economy. And that's one Darwinian race that actually ended. So these things, these parts of evolutionary trajectories, the games that end, they tend to define the system as a whole. So this is kind of the DNA of the ecosystem. And if you look at a lot of the writing, you see some recurrent themes. That there are three basic types of ecosystems in human history. So one is barbarian ecosystems. So these are typically known as segmentary civilizations, and these are things that you can think of as being reversibly assemblable. They're like IKEA furniture. So Arab tribes are a good example. So neighboring tribes come together to fight against like a distant tribe, but when the distant threat goes away, they kind of split apart and start fighting with each other. That's a segmentary model. Keep in mind that, think of it as reversible. If you can sort of assemble and disassemble a system with equal ease, that's a segmentary system. And barbarian societies tend to be like this, that technology tends to be like this. Civilized ecosystems, Herbert Simon was the one who first studied these in significant detail. They tend to be complex, and one way to understand this, again, a symptom, a litmus test, is irreversibility. If you want to tear them apart, entropy increases and you have to actually do some tearing. Like, there's things to tear. Like, it's not like disassembling IKEA. You can't easily put it back together again. Like, if I'm drawn and quartered, you can't put a whole human being back together. It's complex systems. So these are what I call civilized. And then there is very mature civilized systems, which are typically called rentier ecosystems. That's my phrase, but rentier is a French term from the French Revolution. It's when things get so civilized and the asymmetric games are so mature that there are people at the top who are doing nothing, right? So these are typically called the rentier classes. So they own assets, they own productive tools, and they're sitting there collecting rent, And since they don't actually have to do any thinking to do that, they tend to become weak and decadent, and they kind of become easy prey for barbarians to take apart. So that's kind of the basic creative destruction cycle of civilization. Yeah.
I don't want to hijack this, but this is similar to the Baroque sort of recursive model, that,
Yeah.
not recursive, but same
Yeah.
sort of cyclical model.
So rentier would be the Baroque phase of a system. Yeah. So it's stratified and decoupled, and one interesting litmus test is, can a foreign invader come, lop off the top, and just take over? So this would be Genghis Khan taking over China in the 13th century, 14th century, right? If you can sort of lop off the top and take over an entire society without disturbing the bottom layers, it means you're sort of in a rentier ecosystem. So ecosystem type tends to determine the kinds of games that play out and stabilize the system. And here is where I start sort of really thinking through the Game of Pickaxes model. Is it good or bad? Is there a way to do this that's non-valuative? So think of it this way. There's a spectrum of games with both ends being fair. So this is Marx's idea of history repeats itself the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce. So it's one of my favorite quotes. And if you look at frontier games like Barbarians populating sort of a new frontier, they tend to be very fair. So Native Americans playing lacrosse, for example, that would be an example of a frontier game, or just gunslingers in the Old West. It's fundamentally fair, it's a level playing field, and skill rules. If you go to the other end, you find that these rentier classes tend to replicate these sort of fair and balanced games as pure gambling. So these are the sort of decadent civilizational elites who, well, gamble just for the fun of it, or play games like golf or croquet, and it sort of becomes like games with the bloodlust taken out. You're not actually killing each other on the battlefield, but you're sort of going through the same dynamic. And in the middle is what people like Roger Martin call unfair games. And these are what I call dynamically quasi-stable, and they have elements of tragedy and comedy. And the interesting thing is that they're not unstable, but for certain periods like decline and fall or ascent of a civilization, which tend to run between 50 to 200 years, they tend to be relative periods of calm actually, even though you're either going uphill or downhill. Things are stable enough that you can actually build institutions and so forth. Okay. But this evolutionary model, the idea that there are unstable games at either end that get destabilized the moment somebody starts an asymmetric games and accumulates an advantage, this actually needs the idea of an endless frontier. Because what happens when frontiers close up, there's nowhere for, like, say, barbarian type mentality people to get exiled to. There's no new weapon they can do, they can sort of take over to chop off the heads of the rentier elites. And what ends up is you kind of get an ossified and completely static civilization because there's nowhere for barbarian forces to come from. And you kind of see approximations of this happening in very well-protected geographic regions. And India actually is a good example because it's protected from three sides by water and the Himalayas on the north, right? So there's aspects of Indian culture that really look like there's no frontiers, that's why it is the way it is. And the interesting thing about this idea of frontiers being necessary for having this sort of increasing complexity civilization is that once a frontier gets exhausted, you need a new one, right? And we kind of ran out of geographic frontiers sometime in the 14th century. So Genghis Khan is interesting because he was the last major barbarian who basically could go toe-to-toe with civilizations and overrun them. And yes, there were sort of isolated pockets after that, but after that it was kind of a walkover for sort of the civilized settled peoples that grew up from agricultural bases. And some people think of the American frontier and how Europeans sort of steamrollered over the continent as being sort of the last barbarian versus civilized face-off. But if you compare that to, say, Genghis Khan steamrolling over China, it doesn't even look like a contest, right? So the American frontier, if there were barbarians involved in that dynamic, it was not the Native Americans, because they were basically a non-factor. I hope I'm not offending people here, but basically they were not a factor in the evolutionary story. So I'll stop and ask a question here just so make sure everybody's awake. And
So the British steamrolling the French. Which happens everybody knows. I mean, they were fairly civilized, weren't they?
Well, but they didn't get comprehensively steamroller. I mean, France is still around.
They did, I think.
The French language still exists. We'll take that up later. So this, how many people have heard of this report, Science, the Endless Frontier, by a guy named Vannevar Bush? All right. So this guy was an advisor to the president. He's the architect of what is now the modern military industrial academic complex for a whole lot of reasons. So I don't know if anybody will answer this sort of question, but if you can, you get a copy of the book or whoever gets closest. So this guy started something called the OSD. I think it was the Office of Science Development or something. It was a World War II era science and technology foundation. That was the precursor to a descendant that is still around today. What would that descendant be? All right, you got it. So you get a copy of that book. You've already got it. Then you go. Thanks. All right, just making sure people are awake. So DARPA. So Vannevar Bush was sort of the father of DARPA. Okay. So going back to this theme of tools. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing here. Rearranging these things. Okay, yeah. So going back to this theme of tools. So the tools determine the nature of the extended humans or species that live in a techno ecosystem, and the nature of the tools kind of determines the sort of flavor of the ecosystem. So I think of this proverb, give a man a fish and he will eat for a day, teach a man a fish and he will eat for a lifetime. That's kind of a barbarian way of thinking. Because if you think about the tool that's involved there, a fishing rod, that's like a tool that you don't need a complicated civilizational infrastructure to build, right? So you kill an animal, gut it, get some, I don't know, guts to make the line with, and you have a branch and you use a piece of bone and you take a hook and you've got yourself a fishing rod. I've never done it, I'm a vegetarian, but it seems simple enough. And I've been hearing maker hackers here who are like hacking cameras and stuff, so I would say that's simple. But the point about it is this kind of technology always keeps humans sort of on top, and it limits how quickly technology can evolve. At the other end, you have rentier tools, which are basically endless refinement into areas where they don't really add much economic value. So forks or spoons or very refined kinds of jewelry, it's like, all right, these people are just super wealthy, like orders of magnitude more wealthy and powerful than the rest. They don't know what to do with their money, so they're building stuff that really doesn't feed back into the technology cycle. And in the middle, you've got these civilization tools, and that's why I picked the pickaxe as a good motif for this evolutionary model. Because if you think about a pickaxe, what does it take to set up and win a pickaxe type game, right? You have an open frontier, everybody's flooding there to find gold, and you decide, all right, I'm going to be smart, I'm going to game this in a heads I win, tails you lose way, I'm going to sell pickaxes. But there's necessary conditions there that a typical gold miner cannot satisfy, right? You need capital to buy pickaxes, you have to stock them. You probably need some muscle to sort of defend your monopoly in that particular mining town. So how many people here are fans of the show Deadwood? So if by the end of this talk this is completely confusing and you hate the very idea, just go watch the entire series. This is like Deadwood theory, basically. So in that you have a very well done example of actual pickaxe selling to miners. And the guy who does it is Seth Bullock, who eventually becomes like a major citizen in the town. And he goes into the town and sets up a hardware shop. He doesn't go into gold mining himself. And he also is like a gunslinger, so he can actually defend his right to be the pickaxe seller. So I like this is my quote here, so you can quote me. That's my attempt to get into the history books. So give a man a pickaxe shop and his descendants will eat free forever. So it sort of sets off this accumulation of asymmetric advantage, and like multiple generations of your descendants can benefit from it. And that's kind of the assumption, but of course it doesn't always work out because, well, as we know that if your great-great-grandchildren get it too easy, some barbarian is going to come and lop off their head, right? Yeah.
I just have some feedback. I want to disconnect on the civilization one because it immediately didn't make sense to me, because pickaxes are fads, and if the market for pickaxes goes away forever, it's not the case. Whereas a man can presumably eat for a lifetime if he wins a fish. It
Yes.
just doesn't seem like it.
So there's actually partly this is a motif for things that kind of build you an accumulating advantage, but yes, that is actually a robustness problem with these kinds of things, because that's why you get that bigger volatility in ecosystems that depend on this sort of tool, because yes, you can have like fad-like effects. But the big point here is that things like pickaxes that allow you to set up a somewhat stable cash flow that's less volatile than people who are sort of facing nature head-on, they allow you to sort of build larger things. And a couple of sort of better examples from the Old West that I'll talk more about later. One is actually Rockefeller during the oil boom. The guy ended up dominating the entire oil industry, but he didn't even actually visit an oil town till late in his career. And the way he won the oil industry was he controlled the chokehold of refining and eventually pipelines and railroads that fed into the refineries as well. So whether or not a particular oil well strikes oil, you still need refining and distribution. So that's another example of a pickaxe. Another in actually the gold rush case would be Cornelius Vanderbilt. This guy never went to California, and he became the first tycoon and the wealthiest man in America off the gold rush because he controlled the steamship route via Nicaragua, where most of the gold miners actually went. Most of them didn't go overland. They went south by steamboat, crossed in Nicaragua or Panama, and then moved up to California. And this guy made the most money off the gold rush ever, because whether or not you make gold, you have to go to California first, and all the gold that's mined there has to come back, so he had government contracts to bring the bullion back as well. So those are sort of broader examples of pickaxe deals. Okay, so this is, I won't talk much about this, but this has sort of a fair amount of solid backing because everybody from Marx to Dawkins has a model roughly like this. Basic idea is that new tools embody new kinds of intelligence, and when a frontier closes, these tools help you build civilization. And a lot of people read the Cain and Abel story as an allegory of farmers killing hunter-gatherers. So that's what happens when civilizational tools build institutions that are powerful enough that you can kind of get rid of the barbarian periphery. But then the tools kind of mature, you have rentier elites, and then, well, I think of it as a flip side, Abel kills Cain, in which case it would be like Genghis Khan killing the Chinese monarchy. So that's the basic cycle. And as a lot of people who analyze this sort of thing have noted, the cycle has been getting faster. If you look at sort of, it's kind of hard to do this stuff empirically, so it becomes kind of a metaphysical model. But whichever way you count the cycle time, it seems to be getting shorter. So I'm going to talk about the last two cycles over the last 3 centuries, but already we know that the current cycle, which is driven by Moore's law, is proceeding far faster than the one that came before, which I'll talk about in a bit. But right now, my calibration is that the cycle takes about 250 years, and the oldest ones took like 1,000 or 2,000 years. And even though it's very hard to sort of empirically validate the model, because you really have to talk about the complexity of the tool system that supports a technology-based civilization, we can look at proxy variables. So for example, if you look at the number of people who were under some sort of paycheck employment, so government or corporate or some form of, you're working for somebody else and getting a steady, risk-free, nominally risk-free paycheck, it was roughly under 20% back in 1780 in America. And slowly, as the big corporations grew and the government also grew, the sort of, I have that as a bottom, but think of it as a peak employment by paycheck was approximately 90% around 1979. Then the trend reversed. So this is an example of a cycle that took more than 200 years. You've got the rise of the corporation and modern states, and you've got like free agency declining. So think of that as a proxy for the number of barbarians in the civilization going down and down. And then finally, 1979, Reagan happened and a lot of other things happened, and it went back up. And these projections, depending on how you count and whether you count temporary unemployment and so forth, it's at least 12% by the biggest official measure that the government recognizes. But if you go by some of the more anthropological measures, like if you work for Manpower Inc. or in some form or the other not counted properly, you would say that almost 40% of the population right now is not under regular paycheck employment. So this is a huge cycle that has happened. Another one, this one has been sort of done to death a little bit. I didn't have time to graph it. But the famous one about before the mercantile colonial era started, India and China both accounted for roughly 22 to 24% of the GDP. Once the mercantile corporations like the East India Company got going, the sort of extraction began, and by the beginning of the end of the 19th century, things were already hitting single digits, and it sort of hit the lowest point sometime in the 20th century. It was like, I think, like at one point India had 2 or 3% or something, really big number. This is often used to make like a cheap political point about, hey, colonialism extracted wealth from Asia and put it in Europe and America. But there's a lot more to that story. For example, per capita GDP in Europe had already started rising by 1300, like 500 years before they hit Asia. And that was kind of part of the technological leverage that allowed them to do the sort of asymmetric trade later on. I'm putting these up just to give you an idea of the sorts of cycles we're talking about here, because the big point I want to make here is that we don't think often about these cycles because they're much longer than the typical human lifespan, which is today around 80 years, but 100 years ago was like 30, 40 years. These things would be like such long cycles you rarely stop to think about them. But they kind of give you a sense of why it's unrealistic to expect to play in a level playing field, right? You have these huge 200, 300-year cycles. Most of the time they're up or down. You should be expecting to play on an up or down slope. So that's kind of a very quick and dirty way of understanding the idea. Okay, so a point to note about these sort of creative destruction dynamics is that these pure frontier and rentier periods are extremely short-lived. At either end of the pendulum swing, things tend to break. Like pure barbarian societies, somebody eventually finds a pickaxe to sell and starts building up a new civilization. And at the other extreme, if you've got like a French Revolution kind of scenario, everybody gets pissed off enough that heads start to roll. And like currencies get debased and all sorts of things happen, right? So most people spend most of their lives playing civilization games, and actually ours is one among the generations that actually has got to live through an inflection point, because the cycle is shortening and getting comparable to human lifespans now. So tools make and break civilization, and all tools are political. So this is sort of the point I was leading up to. And some tools are just more civilized than others. So I'm going to give you a few examples and sort of help you think about this. Think about the definition I provided earlier about barbarian civilizations being segmentary, like IKEA furniture. You can sort of take them apart and put them together, whereas civilizations, which are like complex machines, you can't really take them apart that well. So medieval armor versus Roman armor. So who can classify them correctly as barbarian or civilized and explain why? Patrick?
Actually, I'm going to take that view that Roman armor is actually barbarian, because
Okay.
of the interchangeable nature of the instruments.
Okay.
I think that's not what you're expecting to say.
No, it gets more complex because if you think about the Roman army, it succeeded an armed model which was based around chariots, and chariots tended to be fairly sort of, they were run by noblemen, and they were sort of separable in a sense, so you didn't need standing armies. The Roman army had to be a standing army because of its discipline and higher level organizational structure it needed. And the interesting thing about the medieval knight, British knight, was that economically, this thing was like a huge dead weight. Like war horses are really expensive. The armor that a medieval knight used, horribly expensive. It took a retinue of like half a dozen people to maintain that horse plus rider unit in fighting condition. And what did that lead to? It led to like the barons, right? You need an entire castle and like farmland supporting you. But the result was you got a segmentary civilization. The king said, hey, let's go invade France. All the barons would come together, form an army, but they didn't need to stay together in a standing army. And that's why you have this much more federalist dynamic in Britain. There's the Arab armies before the Turks were very similar, where tribes would come together and whatever large agglomeration was needed to defeat the latest enemy. So in that sense, they were reversible. The English longbow versus the crossbow. This one, the English longbow, is a very cheap tool. It can be made, it's a very efficient weapon, But unlike the crossbow, which was typically part of the knight's model, it was very cheap, so it allowed the commoners to ally with the central imperial power, and it helped create like a more imperial structure that was more civilized. It didn't have as much power for the barons. But these things tend to get complicated because multiple threads interweave, and kings and barons and commoners kind of trade off power. But let's look at a couple of...
So you're just saying the English longbow is more civilized than the French?
No, I'm saying the English longbow was more civilized than the knight model, like the knight with the lance model.
What about the crossbow?
The crossbow is a more complex artifact, and it takes a more complicated civilization, but it still can be done within sort of a baronial level of technology. You don't need like a centralized imperial model. That's actually a somewhat complicated model to analyze.
So which one can't bear?
I would call the English longbow the civilized one. Yeah.
So with these comparisons, is it that you've already modeled this out and decided which one is more civilized and why, or is it almost a philosophical question?
No, I think this is an empirical question that sometimes it's more complex and ambiguous, sometimes it's not. And sometimes it takes a lot of research to prove, but it's not a metaphysical question, it's an empirical one. So I'll give you one easy example. Village clock towers, there were like something like 40 or 50 time zones in the US before the railroads kind of sprawled across America, and they introduced the 4 standard time zones and kind of synced up the entire continent, right? So that was moving strongly from a federal structure to a centralized structure. But Kindle is kind of interesting. I've kind of been thinking about it a lot. Same thing, WordPress versus printing press. These are sort of live action going on now, and it's kind of hard to work out exactly. I think it's most of the things today are tending towards Barbarian, but it's not always easy to determine. Yeah.
So, because I read your blog, I'm familiar with it somehow, but when you use the word barbarian, civilized, you're using in descriptive terms, not moralistic terms.
Exactly, and this is something I do on my blog that annoys a lot of people. I take common words and just, for the hell of it, overload it in the opposite connotation. So on my blog, barbarian is, it's a term of praise, and civilized is an insult. So
I don't think that's good.
that's not good, but it's my style. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not with that.
So do you feel like, for example, a section of your blog where you will reclaim a term, or do you just...
Yeah, there's an article called Return of the Barbarian where I do that. It annoyed a lot of people. Yeah.
Sorry, why longbow civilized?
Because it helped the central imperial power ally with the commoners against the barons. So it reduced baronial power to a certain extent. You see this pattern, it tends to get complicated by other factors like boundary conditions and so forth, but you often see the top and bottom allying against the middle, and the middle being sort of the source of the segmentary structure.
So the only other fun one that I thought was you could do like static or dynamic types for programming languages.
Oh,
I
okay,
feel like
that's
something there.
too esoteric for a program.
Everyone made noises, you've got a market.
Okay, yeah.
But wouldn't the longbow be more civilized than the barbaric, in the sense that the longbow, it's more fair. It takes a lot more skill to use a longbow, and therefore the distribution abilities with the longbow correspond to that individual genetic distribution we showed earlier. Whereas the crossbow is a bit of technology that actually represents the kind of technological extension of the genetic that you associate with civilization.
So this takes some nuance to get used to, because think about how the longbow is actually employed in battle. You rarely had like longbowmen fighting against each other in like duels. In fact, there was like a imperial proclamation that all adult men had to practice with the longbow every Sunday. That came from out of London, I guess. And in actual war, they were deployed in very systematic ways in sort of a larger deployment where the archers would shoot first and the cavalry would charge in. So it was used in that particular format, whereas the crossbow was much more knight against knight kind of method. It was also used in sieges and other situations, but I should probably cross that example, or it tends to, it's a bunny trail. It's a bunny trail that is more complex than the others.
No, I think it's really good, because if I recall, that the English longbow was first brought to market, so to speak, it had massive sort of black swan-like effects on the enemy.
Mhm.
Right? They just laid down this black curtain of arrows
Yeah.
from afar and wiped out armies in minutes.
Exactly.
Really cool.
All right, I meant to give away one more book here.
Can I force you into lean startups and bootstrapping?
Okay.
Get
I would say lean startups are civilized. You and I have talked a lot about this before, and I know a lot of people, for them, civilized is a good term, so take it either way. I think lean startups are basically, they create a much more asymmetric situation that they're more favorable for investors and founders and that just reflects the current conditions, right? I mean, look at the internet boom has happened, we have a mature ecosystem, and it's not like a valuated thing to say that a particular technology is investor-friendly versus founder-friendly, but I think lean startups are much more investor-friendly. But I want to move on from this slide, but I want to give over a book here. So, okay, pattern late versus regular late. So pattern lates are things that take complicated things like the stock of a gun, and instead of having a craftsman have to machine them on a single lathe, you make one master pattern to mount them on one lathe, and then the other lathe can just copy it. So it was one of the first forms of mass production. Somebody classified for me, not you, Patrick, as barbarian or civilized.
Civilized.
Was that?
I did.
All right. I won't ask you to justify it. I agree with you. So. There you go. All right, so that was a fun little exercise. This is kind of one of the most interesting things about this project, just classifying things as barbarian or civilized. Okay, but civilization tools, because they are part of asymmetric games, they tend to codify a de facto asymmetric balance of power, right? It's like, all right, there is a balance of power. It's unions versus management, or gold miners versus a guy selling pickaxes, or Rockefeller versus some individual wildcatter with a single oil well. Huge asymmetry. These people are poor, the other people are rich, but nobody fights. And what happens is that civilization tools that sort of enable asymmetric situations to play out, they codify an asymmetric balance of power so that it sort of stabilizes. And new institutions turn an asymmetric balance of power into a systemic real technique data. Okay, now I promised to explain this term, and I will. Real technique is my sort of analog to realpolitik. This was the approach to international politics that Bismarck and Queen Victoria, for example, practiced in the 19th century, where everybody was so equal militarily, and there was like so much bloodshed before Napoleon, that they decided, let's just create this intricate system of alliances where if that guy attacks me, you and I will band together and beat him, that kind of set of contracts and treaties that made sure nobody fought with each other. And this delicate balance of power situation, it created a lot of diplomatic tension, but it actually eased military tension. It was like, all right, nobody can win here. We are all set up in like, that reservoir dogs kind of situation with everybody pointing a gun at everybody. We can all relax a little bit and everybody put your gun down. That's what a détente is. It's a relaxation of tensions when you have a very balance of power kind of situation where everybody knows that it's kind of pointless to fight. And in this case, what I'm trying to get at here is that the détente occurs around an asymmetric balance of power, which is kind of unusual. Because in politics, people think of symmetric balances of power, but in technology, you often have these asymmetric balances of power where it's like, all right, we give up, these people own the lathes, these people own the complicated machinery to run the factories, and we can only do minimum wage labor in it, and you can unionize and fight to some extent, but at some point, you gotta admit that this is the way the world works, and you kind of give up. So what this does is it creates islands of stability around fundamentally asymmetric situations, and this is where you get civilizational social order. This is why you and I don't go around trying to kill Bill Gates before he gets to his second million, because we're so used to this is the way we think of life, that we tend to define periods of normalcy around institutions that sort of normalize and create détentes out of asymmetric situations. Complicated thought here, and again, I don't have like a very persuasive case yet. This is what I hope to sort of research and at least argue for with some degree of persuasiveness over the next year or so. But let's do a couple of examples. Another book distribution option point here. So whoever can tell me who wrote this gets a copy of the book. So take a guess, it's probably going to be right. This is from approximately 1873. It was from a very well-known social commentator who coined the term the Gilded Age. He was talking about how America is characterized by all these people striving with each with their own pet scheme, trying to get rich with their own startup mentality. And this has good and bad features to it. So, any guesses?
Was it American or European author?
If somebody can get it without that hint, I'll.
Ben Franklin?
Was it Thomas Edison? The Marx?
Yep, Scott.
It was American, okay, I'll give you a hint. Who gets it now? Mark Twain, thank you. He coined the term the Gilded Age. And let's talk a little bit about this last cycle where Mark Twain was a contemporary, almost an exact contemporary of Rockefeller, Carnegie, JP Morgan. So they all were born and died within a few years of each other. And let's talk about Mark Twain and sort of how he saw the world around his time. Huckleberry Finn, awesome book. It's one of my favorite books, and I think of it as all kinds of awesome. It described what was normal then, right? The sort of agrarian economy where kids grew up having fun in the villages. There were steamboats on the river and so forth. It was a pretty decent book. Another book I want to mention is A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and though I don't have the thing here, I have one last book. I think I'll give it out here. If somebody can tell me why Connecticut? Okay, this might be a tough one. Connecticut was basically the Silicon Valley of the day. Connecticut River Valley was basically the Silicon Valley of the late 19th century. And the Gilded Age is his attempt to grapple with the new normal that was coming up. And Mark Twain, in my view, is one of the finest observers of social condition in any time in history. And he's kind of one of the people I aspire to sort of emulate in some ways. But this is kind of a cautionary tale that the world he understood so well, the previous normal, he was able to describe it beautifully. The stuff that was going on, this was kind of a startup novel in a sort of allegorical form. He kind of got it, but he kind of did. It was a decent novel, but it was a bit of a hack job. And The Gilded Age was his attempt to really grapple with what was going on. And it's a pretty bad book. Like, I couldn't get through it. And he focused almost entirely on the corruption in Washington and New York and so forth. And he actually knew Rockefeller personally. He knew Vanderbilt personally. He liked Rockefeller. He hated Vanderbilt. His analysis of both of them were kind of messed up. So he really didn't get what the new age that was coming about was really about. So it tells you, like, if somebody like Mark Twain had a hard time grappling with enormous change, it's going to confuse everybody. Yeah.
Were those dates correct? Gilded Age was the first one?
Yeah, Gilded Age was actually the first one. So there's an element of he was maturing as a writer, but also he took on.
How well did he do financially?
He did reasonably well. He was kind of, well, he was almost a blogger of his time. He would go around doing talks, and he did a lot of travel correspondence. So he did pretty well, and towards the end of his life, he was actually supported by one of Rockefeller's proteges, I forget his name. But yeah, he was kind of living as a rentier off Rockefeller to a certain extent.
He had a patron.
Yeah, he had something of a patron, but he was always suspicious of wealth, and he had one of the sort of most accurate views of wealth. Okay, so what happens when an old normal is breaking down, an old social order is breaking down, and a new one is emerging? If things aren't happening in sort of a smooth enough way, and the future is coming at you faster than you can sort of build equilibria and detents and institutions around it, you get this sort of situation which I describe as future nausea. And this is a post I did a few weeks back, so I have like 4,000 words on these two terms. So I won't say too much about it, but just think of it as, all right, things are chaotic, you tend to get confused, how do you cut through confusion? So Mark Twain got confused by a future nausea in a sense, and this is another term I coined, manufactured normalcy field. Think of it as the user interface of a civilization. So the UI was getting crappy and collapsing, old version of Firefox with bad JavaScript.
So this is what people, so it's going to be called ideology.
Not quite. I really am thinking about normalcy. Okay, think about it this way.
That's what ideology is.
In the postmodern sense, I'm using it much more in a slightly different sense. Think about flying in an airplane. In many ways, an airplane is like a completely unheard of experience. You're flying at 500 miles per hour, and the thing, if you actually took it through all its motions, would actually throw up nausea, right? It's like an unprecedented human experience that evolution didn't prepare us for. But the way it was kind of normalized in civilization is that except for fighter pilots and people who are in sort of some scary air incident, most of us treat it like riding on a bus because planes are actually carefully designed to preserve that sense of normalcy. They don't accelerate too fast, they don't bank too fast, they don't climb too fast. All that is actually designed to sort of keep your experience within the bounds of riding on a ship or in chariot or something. So in user experience terms, this is one of my hypotheses, no matter how radical the technology shift is, the job of a user experience person, whether it's at a civilization level or a product level, is to move the user experience as little as possible. And vehicular transportation is one of the best examples because we've evolved from chariots to airplanes, and it's basically the same experience. You get in, you sit on something that looks like a seat, you hold something that looks like reins, and then you kind of move forward, facing forward. And really, space travel was the first time that we truly couldn't keep up and normalize that situation. And well, if they commercialize space travel for tourists, I'm sure they'll succeed in doing that. But that's what I mean by normalcy. Okay. So how do you cope when normalcy is breaking down? Let's look at the precedent of how different people, by coping I don't just mean like not throw up, but actually thrive in a chaotic culture where normal is breaking down. So a few examples from the 19th century. So this is kind of whimsical, don't take it too seriously. I think of it as you pick two. And you can't make complete sense of it, you can't see the beauty in it, and you can't make money off it all at once. So think of John Rockefeller as he picked beauty and money. He kind of created a new order of like oil flowing through. Don't think of like the ugly oil fields and union strikes. Think about the beauty of the new order we created around petroleum, right? You have people like J.P. Morgan. They make money and cents. So J.P. Morgan is largely credited with bringing sort of the crazy exponential explosion of 19th century technology, moderating it and turning it into a sort of data on equilibrium. So he basically arranged a lot of mergers and acquisitions. At that point, the US didn't have a Federal Reserve and the government financial institutions were like nothing. And he was basically the central banker of the US. And he created what was the modern regulatory regime, which Reagan finally dismantled in around 1981. So he created the new normal in a sense. And regulation, interstate commerce commission, all those elements that created an equilibrium that lasted for like 60 years was J.P. Morgan. And then there's people, typically engineers, morologues, who see the beauty and sense, but kind of don't put it in a larger social context and make money off it. Blanchard is the guy who created the pattern and lake that I talked about. So he was responsible for a huge number of innovations in the Springfield Armory, which was kind of the Stanford University or park of its day. So Connecticut Valley was like Silicon Valley, Springfield Armory was kind of the startup hub, and all the innovation was happening in that one region. And he was kind of like a, well, I'll show you who is analogous to in a minute when I map this to our time. But okay, so I think of this as people who destroy the old normal by disrupting it to the new normal. Then the creators of the new normal who create the equilibrium. Then there's the engineers involved in constructing the new realities and user experiences. And this doesn't just involve technology people, it also involves like writers and artists. So Mark Twain was an example of a writer who sort of failed to create a new normalcy, but Edith Wharton, I think of as a very successful novelist. She was born about 20 years after Mark Twain, and her novels about the Gilded Age are beautiful. They totally capture the spirit of the time. Okay, so money, beauty, sense, we are kind of in a similar situation now. Pick two, don't take it too seriously. Okay, so this is how I sort of tell the story of the 19th century. So remember I said you need an open frontier and a never-ending frontier. So what happens when you use up the planet and geographic frontiers disappear? Well, one of our Bush's idea and most sort of technologists' idea is that science and technology create new frontiers. It's one of those hypotheses that gets tested very slowly, so we don't yet know if it's true. But in 19th century, the frontier was not really the American West. It was the problem of interchangeability. So by the end of the 18th century, mechanical engineering was actually quite advanced. People could make very complex mechanisms, clocks, and things like that. But it was impossible to scale these things because each thing was like made by a single craftsman, and if you needed cannibalized parts to fix another machine, you couldn't because parts were not interchangeable. And as early as 1765, the French, a guy, I forget his name, yeah, it was actually Grégoire, I don't know how to pronounce that, but he was a general in the French army, and he came up with the idea that really for armies to scale efficiently, weapons need to be made with interchangeable parts. So he proposed the idea. It was actually solved in Harper's Ferry, which was another armory a couple of 100 miles south of the Connecticut Valley. So he was actually kind of sent in exile there. It was like the LA to the Silicon Valley out there. So he was the first one truly showed how to manufacture a complicated artifact out of truly interchangeable parts. Yes, you had a question.
What's your vertical axis?
Vertical axis is complexity of technology. Think of it as entropy or information density. So I'm not, it's in the book, buy the book. But, so this sort of diagram, I call it a double straight out triangle. It's a form of, it's a pattern that occurs in narratives pretty commonly. But the way to read this diagram is, somebody thinks of like a abstract paper napkin concept. There's a lot of exploratory stuff that happens. And then at some point, somebody just has the aha moment and figures out what it is. And in this case, this guy kind of figured out sort of the basic DNA of interchangeability technology. And then it starts to scale out in the technology region, and sort of the idea spread. So this would be, I'll show you the 20th century version in a minute. But basically, then you start having a startup region. Then it starts to percolate through the rest of society. So that's kind of the long, dark valley phase where the old normal gets displaced. And then you have the opportunity for, so this is where all the big fortunes get made, where people are scaling in the dark valley and the technology phase is over. And at some point, the new narratives and systems and models are created, and you have kind of like a new normal that's defined. And in this case, I would say Taylorism defined the model of industrial technology that was based on the idea of interchangeable parts. Taylor himself was a bit of a whack job, but a lot of the ideas that he kind of put together, it came from people like John Harris Hall and Kevin Blanchard, Alexander Hawley, so all these late 20th century, 19th century people, and they created this new frontier of interchangeability. And I call that Hall's law, where interchangeability made things cheaper, 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 and sort of really exploded the potential of mechanical engineering. It was the Moore's law of its time. There's an article I wrote about this on my blog. It's called Hall's Law. Let's map the same thing to our time. Again, you pick two. I think of Steve Jobs as somebody who created beauty and money, but we still haven't completely made sense of what the hell he did. Like we're still absorbing the impact of the iPad, for example. Somebody like Jeff Bezos, he makes money and sense. Amazon, it's kind of far easier to understand what Amazon does. He's like a really, really canny strategic Go player, and he's kind of like creating a new normal around lots of familiar areas that we understand, like shopping. And of course, you have people like Dennis Ritchie, who are kind of the beauty and sense. Everybody knows who Dennis Ritchie is, right? Inventor of the C programming language, wrote Unix. Basically, all of our modern technology runs off the work of Dennis Ritchie. He died recently around the same time as Steve Jobs, and pretty much nobody noticed. His impact was, no, I mean, it's not even a question amongst technologists. Dennis Ritchie's impact has been far more than, Apple couldn't exist without Dennis Ritchie, let me put it that way. Okay, so same kind of pattern. The aha moment, I would say, was when people suddenly realized that Moore's law was what was a new frontier. It was creating a technology frontier that was growing very fast exponentially, and you had to fill it up. This was kind of the spark years, and I really think Alan Kay figured out what Moore's law really means. His famous phrase, "you need to waste bits," that really captures the spirit of Moore's law, because before that, mainframe computing and like vacuum tube computing, people thought that you had to conserve computing because it's like so precious and brittle. But with transistors and integrated circuits, Alan Kay realized that these costs are going to plummet, and soon bits will be really, really cheap. So you'd better start building technology right now based on the premise that this stuff is going to be dirt cheap in 10 years. And he succeeded and created modern personal computing, right? And here, again, I have my sort of Taylorism moment. That would be the moment Amazon turned profitable, and suddenly people started realizing the outlines of the new normal, right? And right now, Amazon is really up to interesting things. They're basically trying to take traditional retail out of business. Okay, so the big picture, going back to sort of the planetarium level idea here, is that This is an evolutionary process just like biological evolution. It involves ecosystems, it involves these weird species of extended humans and sort of bags of memes. And these things sort of evolve with sort of a punctuated equilibrium kind of, people have heard the term punctuated equilibrium? Who has not heard of the term? Okay, so punctuated equilibrium is a term in biological evolution that says that evolution doesn't happen smoothly, it happens in fits and starts. So there's an event known as the Cambrian explosion, I don't know the exact date, like some gazillion years ago, when most of today's species came about. Like there's a sudden speciation event over like just a few million years, which is like an eye blink in evolutionary timeline, and lots of species sort of came about very quickly, and then there was a longer period of equilibrium. So that's a punctuated equilibrium evolutionary model. So technology is also, in my opinion, a punctuated equilibrium that goes between sort of future nausea phase when normal is breaking down, and you have these sort of real technique kind of equilibrium. And that's the last idea I want to talk about, which is the new normal does not just emerge, it is designed. That's why I call it the manufactured normalcy field. Because these things, there's sort of a hippie kumbaya approach to the stuff that says, oh, beautiful new stuff just emerges. And this is absolutely not true. Just look at technology history and you realize that lots and lots of things were very carefully engineered top down. JP Morgan basically created modern America in around 1910s or so. Post-World War II, America was basically engineered by one guy, one Lord Bush. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there's a huge amount of top-down design that goes into creating a new normal. And this idea actually goes back to the earliest eras of American history. So this is one of my favorite big fat books, which I still haven't finished. It's Albion's Seat by David Hackett Fisher. It's a beautiful history book. It talks about how modern American culture was created out of 4 waves of immigration coming out of England. So there were the people who settled in Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims. Then there were the more monarchic royalties who settled in Virginia. There's a third group that ended up in Pennsylvania, the Quakers. And the fourth group would be the people who ended up in the mountains from the north of England. So they are kind of today's Appalachian people who complain about being stereotyped as the Delawareans people. They're more important in American history than that. Okay, it was a long sentence. Okay, so the point Fisher made is that civilization or way of being or so-called normal, you can think of it not as a bunch of isolated things like this is how we work, this is how we eat. It's not a bunch of little behaviors. It's an interlocking complex of behaviors that sort of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And this is like a complex sentence, but it's a direct quote, it's worth reading. It's a normative structure of values, customs, and meaning. So the meanings part is important. You figure out what a technology means, right? But it's the last phrase that's important. It's the deliberate contrivance of a cultural elite. So there's an elite that decides what the new normal is going to be. Jeff Bezos is one of the elites right now. So think of this as there are people who sit around designing the user experience of the new normal. And Fisher in his book describes like sort of a DNA for normalcy. So think of this as sort of a chromosome for culture. And it's about, I actually think there's like 23. Somebody corrected me, but I counted 23. So it's almost like a chromosome. So speech ways, building ways. These phrases make sense to you, right? How you talk, what the linguistic culture is, how you build your residential and work areas, how families are structured, going down like what are power relations in the society, how is law and order maintained. So all these are like different strands of DNA that define different aspects of normal. This is like, since most of his analysis was based on early America and the pre-technological era, a lot of this is sort of pre-modern technology culture, so there would be, but it still sort of works. And it's useful to sort of see just how much normalcy has changed between the 2 big waves we've talked about. We talked about the Hall's law, interchangeable parts shift from one normal to the other, and then Moore's law from another normal to the new normal that's being manufactured. I'll just take a few highlighted ones as examples. So take parenting. The 1780s, it was just traditional parenting, right? What we think of mom and dad raising the kid. By 1979, really you should be saying that television was raising most kids. And now, in 2012, we can already see that kids are sort of glued to their iPads. I have a nephew, I don't have kids of my own, but I have a 7-year-old nephew. The guy just lives, he was initially living off his iPod Touch, and now it's completely iPad. And I'm hearing reports from parents that young kids think their TV is broken because they can't touch it and make things move. They're so used to touch. So they're being kind of raised by their iPads in a sense. Take things like family structures, right? You had like traditional patriarchal family structures, then it became the nuclear family of the industrial era. Now you have the sitcom modern family, and you have gay parents adopting children, right? So the very idea of family has changed. So all these sort of basic DNA elements of what is normal tends to shift radically, but in a very engineered way whenever a new technology, really big technology wave happens. But, okay, so I'll stop there. Book, I hope to get it done by 2014. You can go to the site, there's an email list, you can sign up. I'm hoping to do a Kickstarter project to help fund some of the research I need to do. So if you sign up, expect to see some Kickstarter spam from me. And stop there and take any questions.
I don't know if this is a first order effect, it's not important for your zeroth order model, but on the assignment you asked if we are miners or pickaxe sellers. And I was thinking, aren't any of us both? Take Apple computer.
It's not a zeroth or first order effect, it's a passive effect. I think we added that slide.
I was just sort of. But you make an important point, though. You make an important point.
Yeah, I mean, take something like Apple Computer. It's a pickaxe seller relative to its customers, but it's a miner relative to its suppliers who give it like Intel, which gives it the chips.
So it is in the model, it was buried in some of the terminology I'm bringing up, the whole recursive aspect of what the ecosystem looks like. So yes, at one level you may be a pickaxe seller to sort of entities you subsume, but at another level you may be competing in sort of much more brutal ways. The broader point though is that the whole thing becomes asymmetric. The whole technology infrastructure tends to become asymmetric, and that's usually possible only because you've actually discovered a true new frontier where there is new wealth, right? You can't create asymmetry out of nothing. In the 19th century, the asymmetry was created out of fossil fuels, right? Suddenly you had coal and oil, suddenly humans didn't have to work with muscle power anymore, and that asymmetry allowed a different kind of asymmetry to emerge on the output end. Make sense? So it's kind of like an average aggregate effect.
Has your model led you to any predictions?
That's why I sort of qualified this, that this is a visit to the planetarium. But no, I'm just getting started on this stuff. A lot of this came out of like about half a dozen blog posts that I did that seem to be converging on something. So I've kind of now just started putting the themes together and making broader predictions. Ajay?
So I'm trying to understand your definition of normalcy. I mean, in your framework, it just seems like it's a state past barbarianism, where you have civilization and tools that make most of people aspire to where society maybe.
No, actually it's the reverse of that. It makes them not aspire. So that's the big picture macro effect where you take like an asymmetric situation and say, all right, it's just a fact of life that there are, in wealth terms, people who are 10,000 feet tall compared to me, and I'm going to live with that fact. So that's one aspect of the equilibrium. But the user experience part of that is that we somehow manage to define normal in fundamentally unstable situations where we tend to think of normal as sort of equilibrium unchanging, but this is somehow we've defined, it's like, standing on an uphill slope and gravity is actually at an angle, but you define normal in a weird way and sort of just live with always being about to tip over. And an example here is, this is a phone, right? No, it's a handheld computer. We normalize this. Voice communication is one clunky grandfathered feature on this little device that just has more computing power than the computer that powered Apollo to the moon. This is a handheld computer, but the concept just so messes with our head that it could only be introduced into our normalcy field by sort of putting it in sort of a line of continuous succession to a device we were familiar with, a phone. Yeah.
Can I just follow up with the social analogy, and that is that most people construe normalcy as a period of growth without tension.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And in the framework of punctuated and filtered, normalcy is when everything is growing and everybody is happy.
Exactly.
So-
Lifetime employment,
so
everybody
in that
gets
sense,
attention.
Normalcy is just what happens most of the time.
Yeah, and also because we accept it, and we also have this false illusion that it's going to last forever because of our, lifespan effects, right?
So
If you,
there an inherent is in terms of time, that most of the time society is going.
Actually, can I challenge that gently? So the ancient Greeks actually consider the first view, it's the normal state of human affairs is a state of war, right? And it's not, in fact, when you have normalcy and situation. It's actually a rare event.
that's actually true. I mean, war can be normal. That was also true of Arab nomads. That could be a barbarian sense of normal. Normal just means that you're used to it and you've kind of made up mental models to deal with it. In the Wild West, it was like, all right, it's normal for me to walk around with a gun and it's normal for me to pull it out and try to shoot somebody who insults me. It's kind of completely normal, and we think of it as unthinkable. Back then, it was normal because, well, you would sort of trade hundreds of heads of cattle on a handshake without counting them, so your word had to be like solid gold, right? So it was a state of war that was considered normal. But to your point about, yes, a period of growth, it's, in a sense, it's asymmetric growth. It's like, all right, we've discovered fossil fuels, and because of oil wealth, everybody can grow richer. Hey, these people are going to grow richer far faster than me, and I'm just going to accept that because it's like, this guy's graph is going like this, mine is going a little slower, and I'll kind of just ignore that unstable dynamic and just pretend that prosperity for all, lifetime employment, retirement.
It's really closely related to what it's like as you define normalcy is the opiate of the masses.
Yeah, that's why I said it's Marx is one of the people who should be credited with coming up with the version 1 of this model, because it's only in the last 10 years that we've seen a second example of the cycle run through neoliberal small force. So we can now start to generalize, but yes, it's political in a sense. That's why I said all tools are political. You can make it ideological. So in a way, I'm trying to do political science on tools and technology while remaining ideology neutral myself. That's all right.
The means of production.
Yeah, exactly. So it is political.
So what happens in this model, in this idea of normalcy, when the timescale for technological change, in contrast to how it used to be, becomes short relative to human lifetimes?
So this is where the singularity people believe that a singularity will evolve and it'll take care of its increasing exponential rate of change and sort of hopefully be benevolent and take care of us. So in the singularity versus collapse spectrum of views, I tend towards more the collapse view, where I think things are getting like complex and full of entropy and are going to collapse on top of us. But my general belief is that just because something has been growing exponentially doesn't mean it can continue to. And now that it's crossed this threshold where like complete cycles might possibly happen within a human lifespan, if we can't like remanufacture normalcy that quickly and we are in this constant state of future nausea, it sort of acts as a natural break, right? And you can see that a little bit in Silicon Valley, like more new startups, more new products, just shoving newness and innovation down sort of the attention spans of people. And if it hits a rate limit, it's like, all right, the rate limit is going to determine future evolution and things are going to start fading. That's one view, but it could be that the exponential part becomes decoupled with whether people can cope or not, and that's sort of the extinction scenario. Like, if it is true that minimum wage people who don't have like some computer literacy skills are basically completely useless in the new economy, there are economists who now believe that. Well, in a generation they'll die off, and sort of death will fix the problem. That's an extremist view, that there's no role for them, normal or not, so they'll just be dispensed with. So that's one extreme view.
It's more likely that whatever social crisis is, various people try to figure out how to pay for it.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I don't think technology will sort of become untenable.
I mean, they're not going to die without either picking up weapons or us. I mean, we're back to bread and services. I mean, the Romans did the same thing. This has never changed. I mean, every time society has come under pressure, so that the power elite to control the resources don't want to give the underlings the same amount they did before. They throw them enough bread and circus to keep them quiescent. And if they do it, they, you know, rise up and cut their heads off.
Yeah, so I think the argument you hear from the sort of singularity type people is the general trend is towards greater centralized asymmetry of power, and it becomes easier and easier for people who control the means of production to be so sophisticated that nothing you can be, like everybody talks about, like, you know, Iran election and Twitter being used to create the purple revolution. Look at the infrastructure that takes and how easy, how many single points of control it has and who can choke it off, right? Look at Kindle. We think of it as liberating publishing for the masses, but well, we have that ironic story of Amazon pulling copies of 1984 off the Kindle, right? So it could be that maybe technology can pass a threshold where the dispossessed simply don't have the means to fight back anymore. It could happen, but again, I'm like you, a skeptic. I think the system will stabilize again.
My position on that, I like have a question from essentially the Twitter sphere. But a friend of mine who is apparently more versed in the esoteric vocabulary we use than I am, has asked me to ask a question that I don't understand.
Well, that's quite normal. Questions coming randomly in space, okay?
Go for it.
Yeah, so I've asked her to try to restate it, but in the meantime, I have something to say about it. So the difference is that you have specialized individuals within the dispossessed, the people who can make sense and beauty, can't make money.
Yeah.
They're dispossessed because they don't have money, which is the unit of influence or power. And so they, you said before that people would kind of fly from the bottom to the top, but now with this massive focus on the middle class, it seems, at least, I mean, you can speak more knowledgeably on this than I can. It seems as if the middle class, the middle and the bottom are banding together against the top, or just the middle and forget the bottom.
So this is kind of hard to analyze in general because it's like, well, we are in the middle of future nausea. We can't analyze the whole situation. But take the, my own opinion is that the middle class is kind of disappearing, but ex-middle class people are doing something which I call trading up, which is building like lifestyle design, basically, like figuring out how to hack lifestyles and live middle class standard of living on much lower income. And look at something like Amazon and WordPress, right? At one point, you had these publishing companies controlling access to publishing. I self-published my first book. I plan to self-publish the second. I have my own blog as marketing. This level of leverage for what is essentially the bottom layer in the media space that didn't exist. So in this sense, I'm kind of now allying with Jeff Bezos and Matt Mullenweg to take out like the cocktail party New York publishing circuit, right? So that's one sense, that's part of what's happening. But this is me as sort of an exile from the middle class doing that. When you actually look at like minimum wage, people with like zero skills in any of these areas, it's hard to see how this can happen in specific cases. But in theory, this is a well-known idea. So Hegel was the first one who thought of it as, you have sort of the slave morality and the master morality, and slaves can sort of self-actualize through work. And that was Hegel's way of doing technology before people thought about technology. That was kind of a very metaphysical way of saying it, but yes, it could be that somebody, even without all the advantages of all the infrastructure, somehow goes to a public library, learns through TED Talks, comes up with a new idea, and disrupt. So yes, but statistically, will enough people do that to make a significant difference and rescue the entire bottom third of the pyramid?
In Mitt Romney as well, yeah.
Yeah. It's a crap. I don't know, we've seen 20 years.
So just to respond, it seems like I was phrasing or thinking in terms of the individuals, so we have the kind of bell curve distribution.
Can we move that to after? Let's do a few more questions because it's good night. I know Ben gets tired. Let's do a few more questions. We've got a few more, and then we can go.
Maybe from this
through
side,
after.
this side is kind of
Do you feel like sort of, individualism versus, collectivism, community dynamic, does that fit into the Folkways model in any way?
That's actually one of the most fascinating subjects that has had some real good recent work. So until recently, most political scientists had this abstract model which they call man in the state of nature, which was about all individuals fighting with all individuals, or all individuals sort of living alone but happy and peaceful. So these were the models of Hobbes and Rousseau. But more recently, people are trying to make these models more evolutionarily realistic, and if you look at our evolutionary history from apes and stuff, it becomes clear that we are fundamentally a collective species first and an individualist species later. And Francis Fukuyama has written like a brilliant book, The Origins of Political Order, that came out last year, and he sort of works through this argument very carefully. And basically the answer is individualism is a construct that emerged in the 13th century, again in England. Lots of these troublesome ideas seem to appear from here. So individualism is basically longbow 13th century creation. It was individual as normal, the idea that a single person could be an economically independent actor in a political sphere, that's actually pretty new. So it is an aspect, but increasingly an irrelevant one, because things are getting so complex that, like I said, what's the unit of analysis for analyzing evolution? So I think of myself as a free agent, but I don't have a boss, I work for myself, all my consulting gigs are one person, but then I rely on this huge complicated infrastructure. And if I think of myself as a weird species, I'm a guy who likes to think about long-term historical cycles that are like, more than 200 years. So I'm this weird individual who is kind of like a redwood tree that lives 2,000 years in an extended sense, because I read these books and all these old things. So in that sense, yes, I'm an individual, but in the sense of what does it take to make me that extended human being, I'm obviously a collectivist. I couldn't exist without everything else that allows me to extend myself in certain ways, right? So it's kind of almost become a moot point with too much technology. Anything else? Go more this side.
How does this relate to, let's say, the battle of the sexes? Women's role in this context and men's role in the same context? And do you see any trends over the long period of evolution, from Paleolithic times or whatever, pre-farming times?
So that's a can of worms that's always dangerous to get into. So I'll give you a two-part answer. One, for the actual biological part of the answer, you might want to try the Red Queen by Matt Ridley. And it's a brilliant book about how human evolution in its later stages, after we kind of became smarter than the rest of the apes, it was driven primarily by a sexual arms race with men and women basically trying to do an arms race with each other. Men tried to pretend that they were healthier and stronger than they were. Women developed systems to increasingly figure out that they were not as healthy and disease-free as they were. So that's sort of the biological battle of the sexes. But going back to, all right, is this evolutionary path more like a single species or an ecosystem? Well, in sort of a very minimalist way, sexual dimorphism is a speciation event. Like if you look at asexual species, they're like a single species, but a sexually dimorphic species is like two kind of related species evolving together. And again, my answer is similar to my previous answer, which is once you do this technological extension, it creates these like freaks of nature who can one of the new freaks of nature is a data scientist. He or she can upload like a 50 petabyte thing into his extended brain and analyze it and come up with trends. Now this freak of nature, male or female, is so different from the rest of humanity that almost the gender gap starts to become irrelevant once you start thinking of how technology drives speciation. But gender, of course, is fundamental in certain very basic ways that technology doesn't get at. So, open question.
So you see the roles changing in any way, or do you see them staying the same over this more advanced technology phase we're going through?
I think the distinction will become increasingly irrelevant and other distinctions will matter a lot more, like I said. So, yeah, whether you're a data scientist or not will matter more than whether you're male or female.
Hi, I've got a sort of minor question and then a larger one. The minor one is just when you were talking about games, you didn't give an example of civilization games, so I have a handle on what the two poles of the spectrum were, but if you could just talk about what games are like in the civilization phase. And then the slightly larger point, so first, periods of future nausea, there's always this kind of historical pessimism that like we'll be in sort of permanent a permanent state of future nausea. But as the kind of rate of change increases, I'm wondering if you could talk about the moment at which institutions are unable in a permanent way to keep pace with the accelerating rate of change. And if that is going to create a sort of like, if the normal then becomes a state of kind of institutional inability to deal with it.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I feel like Charles Strauss's science fiction writer deals with some of those issues about accelerating rates of change and inability for the normal to catch up. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So, all right, there was the first question was examples of asymmetric pickaxe games. So an example is a hedge fund, right? It's a game, you're investing, but one side fundamentally has a better control of the game than the other. So a hedge fund is an example of an asymmetric civilizational game. It requires the infrastructure of civilization to work. So I had a bunch of examples, I think, on the second slide. I'll put these slides up on SlideShare. Your second question, can accelerating change exceed sort of the ability to cope, so institutions fail to form, that kind of thing? That was my initial conclusion in the post when I first explored this concept, and I basically mapped that state to a dark age, right? So fall of Rome to Renaissance, that 1,000-year period, scholars no longer call it a dark age because there was lots of very vigorous innovation and lots of barbarian innovation that went on, barbarian in my sense of the term. So it was not a dark age in that sense of like, being like ignorant and horrible and like a state of like being like, I don't know, animals or something. It wasn't dark in that sense, but it was dark in the sense that there was no sense of shared normal across a large continent, in this case Europe, right? Because it all broke down, everybody tried to be Roman emperor, nobody quite succeeded, so it all kind of broke down, and the Roman Empire gave way to all these little smaller normalcy fields. So my initial hypothesis, which I'm still not completely happy with, is think of the normalcy field as a big bubble, and if the institutions can't keep up, it breaks into lots of smaller bubbles. So local institutions that are sort of more transient manage to keep up locally, but global normalcy fields don't catch up. And that's, in a sense, that's what the conclusion there would be. If today that's happening, we'll be entering a new dark age. Standards of living may be high, we may all love our lives, but history in like 30,000 BC may look back and say, this age between year 2000 and year 2500 makes no sense. We'll call it a new dark age, right? They might judge us that way, because already look at it. I mean, California is a world apart from somewhere in the heartland of China, and new normals are being manufactured in places like India or Latin America that really don't have the uniformity that the 70s and 80s had, where everybody was working for corporations for a lifetime. So normal is breaking down and local normalcy is coming up, but I'm not completely happy with this one, to be honest. I don't like this model.
Let's take one more question. I know Bruce had a question. Let's take one more, and then so I think you're getting tired, or you keep going if you want. I don't want to exhaust you.
Yeah, let's make this the last, and after that we can sort of
wrap it up after the end.
I mean, I was curious, Grappling with future nausea, it sounds a lot like future shock. I wonder if there's a differentiator that you see in that.
Toffler and the early futurists are kind of interesting, because if you look at Alvin Toffler's future shock and the works when he sort of developed these concepts, you can see that he was a good futurist. He actually anticipated a lot of what we're seeing. So for example, he thought of modular housing and people working in like little modular places instead of in a cubicle. But today, what do we have? We have Airbnb, we have co-working spaces like this. So he kind of got the sort of structural evolution of how things would change, and he failed to get like how the user experience part would evolve, right? Airbnb, think of how we normalized that concept. B&B is bed and breakfast, right? So it's extending the normalcy of a concept that dates back to, I don't know how old bed and breakfasts are, but it's like an extended normal concept. So when it actually arrives, we don't actually recognize it in the sense that Toffler did. So when you read Toffler's stuff, like even now, it seems kind of alien and out there. It's like, wow, he's describing a world that is kind of completely weird. I can't imagine it, people living in little modular places and so forth. But when it actually comes, it's like, oh, okay, I get it. So it's like, the future doesn't quite arrive in the form you expect. So in that sense, there is no such thing as future shock if normalcy can keep up. If normalcy can keep up, you can cope with all sorts of change because we normalize handheld computers as phones, right? We kind of make it normal. So the reason I like future nausea as a better term is like shock is like being hit on the head and then you fall down and can't keep up. Nausea is like things increasingly look chaotic and make no sense. You're like stagnating around, trying to find islands of order, survive, make some money. But life starts making less sense, and if you pay too much attention, you throw up. It happens to me almost. Like if I spend too much time thinking about this stuff, I have to like put it aside and walk away and think about like normal things for a while. It really does make your gut wrench in some ways.
So great, thank you so much.